Michael Johnson only wanted to honor veterans with a small sign on his lawn, but instead, he was threatened with crushing fines and even the loss of his home. At the center of it all stood Karen Miller, the HOA president, whose heavy-handed rules and relentless pressure left neighbors stunned, but hidden in the fine print of city maps and bylaws was a detail that turned the entire battle upside down. And just wait until you hear the shocking twist that followed, and how, in the end, justice came out on top. When I first moved into my new home in the suburbs of Austin, I thought I had finally found peace. The neighborhood looked picture perfect. Freshly mowed lawns, white fences, families walking their dogs in the evenings. For years, I had dreamed of living in a place like this, where my kids could ride their bikes on the street and where the loudest noise at night would be the sound of crickets. To me, that house wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was the result of years of hard work. I'd juggled multiple jobs, saved every extra dollar, and finally managed to secure the mortgage. That front yard was more than grass. It felt like a little piece of freedom. Not long after moving in, I decided to place a small sign at the edge of the lawn. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple sign that read, "We support our veterans." It was a way to show respect, a reminder that our community should never forget those who served. To me, it was meaningful, but to anyone else, it looked like nothing more than a modest message sitting by the sidewalk. No flashing lights, no noise, nothing to disturb anyone. For 2 days, I barely thought about it. Neighbors waved at me when I drove by. Kids walked past the house on their way to school, and life felt normal. But then, everything changed with a single knock. It was early evening when I heard it. Sharp, deliberate knocks on the door. Not the kind of knock from a friendly neighbor stopping by to say hello, but the kind that immediately puts you on edge. When I opened the door, there she was, Karen Miller, the president of the HOA. Even before she spoke, her body language said it all. Arms crossed tightly, lips pressed in a thin line, eyes scanning me like I was guilty of something. She didn't smile, didn't introduce herself. She went straight to the attack. "This sign," she said, pointing over my shoulder with a quick jab of her finger, "ruins the neighborhood aesthetic. You need to remove it immediately. HOA rules don't allow things like this." Her tone was icy, every word clipped as if she was delivering a final verdict. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. I glanced back at the sign, sitting quietly near the edge of the lawn. It wasn't blocking anything, it wasn't offensive, and it wasn't hurting a soul. It was just a small piece of wood with a message of respect. In that moment, I felt my blood rush to my face. Anger bubbled up before I could even form the words. This wasn't a giant billboard. This wasn't some loud decoration. It was a simple, heartfelt statement. And yet, Karen was acting like I had violated some sacred code. I wanted to laugh at how absurd it was, but the seriousness in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't joking. She truly believed that my little sign was some kind of crime against the neighborhood. Standing there in my doorway, I realized this wasn't just about a sign. This was about control. And Karen had just made it very clear that she wasn't going to let me live in peace. The morning after my encounter with Karen, I checked the mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA. I already had a bad feeling before I even tore it open. The envelope was plain, but the bold HOA letterhead on top sent a chill through me. Inside was a typed letter filled with legal-sounding language, all sharp and cold, but one line stood out, clear as day. Failure to remove the unauthorized sign will result in daily fines and may lead to foreclosure proceedings on your property. I read that line over and over again, unable to believe it. My heart sank. Fines? Foreclosure? Over a sign the size of a backpack? I sat down at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in my hands. It felt heavier than it should have been, like the words themselves carried weight. My stomach twisted into knots as I thought about what this could mean. I had been scraping by just to keep the mortgage paid. At times, it felt like every paycheck was already gone before it even hit my account. And now, this piece of paper was threatening to take away everything I had worked for. I glanced around the kitchen, the space that Amy and I had dreamed about when we first walked through the house. The cabinets we planned to repaint, the little breakfast nook where our kids would one day sit. All of it suddenly felt fragile, like it could be ripped away at any moment. Amy came in, still in her robe, holding a cup of coffee. She saw my face and asked, "What's wrong?" I handed her the letter without saying a word. Her eyes scanned the page, and almost instantly, her face fell. She sat down across from me, staring at the words as if they were in another language, and then tears started welling up in her eyes. "Michael, they can't really do this, can they?" Her voice cracked. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her that it was all just empty threats, that everything would be fine. But the truth was, I didn't know. And that uncertainty cut deeper than anything else. Amy buried her face in her hands, quietly sobbing. Seeing her like that hit me harder than the letter itself. This home was supposed to be our safe place, our fresh start. Now it felt like a target. I sat there frozen, caught between anger and helplessness. How could a simple gesture of respect turn into something so threatening? It wasn't just about the sign anymore. It was about power. And Karen, standing behind that letter, seemed to be enjoying every second of it. The walls of the house suddenly felt closer, the air heavier. What was supposed to be the beginning of our dream was now turning into a nightmare. And for the first time since moving in, I wondered if we had made a terrible mistake. That night, after Amy had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the HOA letter still lying in front of me. I couldn't shake the fear of losing our home, but at the same time, something inside me refused to give in. The more I thought about Karen's smug expression at my doorstep, the more determined I became. If they were going to threaten me, I needed to know the rules inside and out. I wasn't going to surrender without a fight. I pulled out my laptop and started digging. First, I went through the HOA bylaws page by page. It was slow, tedious reading, pages filled with legal terms and fine print. But I forced myself to push through. Every line felt like it could be the key to proving them wrong. Hour after hour, I highlighted passages, made notes, and cross-referenced sections. I looked for anything, any clause, any technicality that mentioned signs or the edge of the property. But what struck me most was not what I found, but what I didn't find. The rules kept talking about lots and property boundaries, but nothing about the narrow strip of land where I had placed the sign. That nagging detail stayed with me, so I went a step further. I pulled up the county's online property maps, tracing the exact lines of my lot. My eyes widened as I realized something unusual. The strip of grass where I'd put the sign wasn't actually within my property line. Could it be? I needed more proof. I cross-checked with city zoning documents, then with public right-of-way maps. And that's when it clicked. That little stretch of land wasn't mine at all. It was city-owned, a public right-of-way, which meant that not only did the HOA have no authority over it, but Karen's threats had been completely baseless. For the first time in days, I felt a rush of relief. It was like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, almost laughing at how ironic it was. They had tried to intimidate me into removing something that wasn't even under their control. The next morning, I gathered every piece of documentation I could find, printouts of property maps, city records, and the HOA bylaws themselves. My binder was thick with evidence, and holding it gave me confidence I hadn't felt in days. When I walked into the municipal office, my hands were still trembling, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. I approached the clerk at the counter and laid out my papers. "Can you confirm something for me?" I asked, pointing to the highlighted section of the map. "This strip of land, does it belong to the HOA or the city?" The clerk adjusted her glasses, studied the map, and nodded. "Yes, that's city-owned. HOA doesn't have jurisdiction there." Her words hit me like sunlight breaking through a storm. I wasn't powerless after all. Karen's threats were empty, and now I had the proof to stand my ground. The night of the HOA meeting, I walked into the community hall with my binder of documents tucked under my arm. The room was packed. Neighbors lined the folding chairs, murmuring softly as the board members took their seats at the front. At the center sat Karen, arms folded, eyes sharp, wearing the same look of control she had when she stood on my doorstep. I felt my heart pounding, but I also knew something she didn't. I had the truth on my side. When the meeting opened for community comments, I rose from my chair. The room fell quiet as I walked to the microphone, papers in hand. My voice was steady, though inside I could feel the adrenaline. "I want to address the issue of the sign on my lawn," I began. "I received threats of fines and even foreclosure, but after reviewing the HOA bylaws, the property maps, and the city's zoning records, I discovered something important." I held up the papers for everyone to see. "That strip of land is not part of my property. It's a city-owned right-of-way, which means the HOA has no authority over it. Your threats were not only unfair, they were illegal. My sign stays." For a moment, silence hung in the air. All eyes turned to Karen. Her face, usually so composed, went pale. She opened her mouth to argue, but her voice faltered. That's not," she stammered, but the doubt was clear in her tone. The room began to buzz with whispers. Neighbors looked at one another, some nodding, others frowning. Finally, one man in the back stood up and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Karen, you've gone too far. You can't keep harassing people like this." The murmurs grew louder. People who had once stayed silent now found their voices. A woman added, "We should be supporting each other, not tearing each other down." Karen tried to regain control, but the tide had already turned. The authority she once carried had cracked. From that day forward, my little sign stayed right where it was. No more letters, no more knocks on the door. And something even more surprising happened. One by one, my neighbors started putting up their own signs. Some honored teachers, others celebrated firefighters, a few supported local schools or charities. What began as a single act of defiance turned into a wave of expression. The neighborhood no longer felt like a place ruled by fear, but like a community where people could finally show what they believed in. Karen, once the untouchable figure of authority, was suddenly just another neighbor, and a quiet one at that. For me, it was more than just a personal victory. It was proof of something bigger. I realized that you don't have to be powerful, wealthy, or connected to stand up for yourself. Sometimes all it takes is persistence, knowledge, and the courage to say, enough. What started with anger ended with inspiration. And I'll never forget the lesson. Even ordinary people can push back against unfairness and win.